Welcome to Fountainhead Forum 18. I'm talking with William Swig, who is one half of the podcast Ayn Rand Fan Club. And we're going to talk about It's a Wonderful Life and other Christmas related themes for objectivists. How you doing, William?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, it's good to have you on here. Yeah, so first of all, William, how did you get started in all this? How did you get into Ayn Rand?
Well, I was in college, but the story starts when I was in high school because in high school I was introduced to an atheist. And before that, I had never really thought about atheism or even knew about it very much. I suppose I had heard about it, but I'd never met one in real life and had a discussion with someone who was an atheist. So that kind of put me on the path of thinking about whether I wanted to become an atheist because I was raised as a Protestant. And then in college, a friend of mine who was also an atheist took me to a philosophy club meeting, and it happened to be sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute. And I watched a Leonard Peikoff lecture, and that's how I was introduced to objectivism. After that, I wanted to read everything Ayn Rand ever wrote, so I spent a few weeks reading Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead and We the Living. And I just really got into it. And I had a girlfriend at the time who said something to me about, you have to make a choice. Do you believe or do you not believe? And it just hit me, like, well, I don't believe. And I became an atheist. And then I started digging deeper into objectivism. And I decided, well, sounds pretty good to me. I was kind of blown away by what Rand was writing and telling me. And I became an objectivist a few years later.
Oh, was that a Peacock on video, or was that Peacock actually live and in person?
It was on video. So what they would do is the clubs would like rent a video cassette from the Institute, I think. And the first one I remember is Religion versus America. And that's the first lecture that I watched at a meeting. And after that, we would discuss the lecture, and there was a person in the club who kind of talked me through the philosophy. It was just a normal club meeting, and I met Peikoff a few times, and I attended one of his lectures later in life, but I didn't meet him until I started working for the Ayn Rand Institute.
Oh, really? Oh, so how long did you work for ARI?
For a few years.
When about was all this?
This was after 9/11, in the early 2000s. And I actually worked while Yaron Brook was there as his assistant.
Yeah. How many people work for ARI about?
At the time when I was there, it was about 30 or 35, I think.
Oh, wow. And where does most of their revenue come from, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, they have big donors. I don't work there anymore.
Okay.
So they have large donors, some of whom have gone public, like Carl Barney. And they get revenue from other sources, the small donors and maybe some institutions.
Okay. Is it where what 20 is it something like where 20% of the donors give 80% of the money, or is it
I don't really know because I wasn't on that side of the corporation.
okay. Yeah, that's always interesting. I don't know if there's anything else to say. We're kind of going away from the topic here, but
Yeah, some of that is public knowledge. I think you
yeah,
can look up
yeah.
their
Yeah,
tax records.
do you think ARI still gets most of their new recruits by the cards in the books, or do you think they get them other ways?
When I was there, they got them through several ways. The essay contests, campus clubs, public outreach.
Yeah.
And, at the college level, they would work with professors and try to recruit graduates as well.
Okay. Yeah. One of the reasons, the main reason why I wanted to bring you on here, of course, is I absolutely positively loved some of your insights into the movie "It's a Wonderful Life," which of course has become this Christmas tradition, and it's a very interesting story. I mean, "It's a Wonderful Life," of course, for the people who may not. By the way, I should also warn we're if you're listening and haven't seen these movies or specials, we are going to spoil you. So if we start talking about a movie you haven't seen, maybe you want to pause this show and watch the movie and then come back after that. We are going to uh, fill this up with spoilers, but anyway, "It's a Wonderful Life," was made in 1946. It's with Frank Capra directed, and of course James Stewart and Donna Reed star in the movie. And as we know, it's about a man uh, who goes through who gets into a financial situation and then ponders killing himself, and then an angel comes down and gives him a glimpse of what the world would look like if he'd never been born. So, so what? Tell us what some of your insights are, and you had some very big disagreements with your Ron Brook about this movie too.
Well, Euron hated the movie
Yeah.
and said so on one or two podcasts. He didn't like the idea that Jimmy Stewart suppressed his desires to go out of town and leave town and see the world and all of that. And I I see it a different way. I see it as more of a story about a young man who has these almost wild instincts about him to just leave the nest and go ramble around the world. But then there are also these forces, you know, attracting him to the home life. He likes this girl, Mary, who is very much a wife material, who likes him and wants to settle down and have a home in their town that they were raised in. Um, he's got a family who owns a building and loan business, and so he's got this natural family tie to the town. Um, so I see it as the main character, George Bailey's struggle between his desire to just wander like a wild man in the West, Old West. You had these frontiermen who would just run off and find excitement and adventure out in the West. It's a struggle between that idea of man and the husband who would settle down with a wife and raise a family in their town. And so this struggle takes place over this Christmas movie, which is based around the holidays. And so I see that on one hand, it's a literary battle between like the Western explorer and the good husband who settles down with a wife.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of things we see with George that I find to be a very interesting character. Uh, from a young age, you see Mary Hatch, who said, when George is deaf, and she says to him, "George Bailey, I'll love you till the day I die." And
Mm-hmm.
of course we see how George, even at a young age, will put himself out there to do the right thing, or like when he rescues, when his younger brother Harry falls into the ice, and George rescues him, and of course that's how he gets the ear infection, and that's how he loses hearing in one ear. And then you also have the incident with Mr. Gower at the pharmacy, where he's this, I guess, kind of a delivery boy, and he finds out that and he notices that Gower's accidentally put some poison in the capsules, and George doesn't make the delivery, and then Gower starts getting mad at him, but then he explains to Gower why he didn't make the delivery, and then Gower thanks him and remembers that. And so there's definitely this, this boy who's idealistic, but then realizes that there sometimes life just gets in the way, and stuff just happens,
Yeah,
you
at
know.
first his view is that it's life getting in the way of his plans. So there's this struggle between his fantasy, he wants to leave and go to Paris and have a harem of wives, when he's younger, when he's a young boy and he's thinking about his future. There's this conflict between his fantasy and then what's really going on in his life in the town. And so he's confronted with the responsibilities and and the and the jobs and tasks and things that a man has to do to survive and keep his community safe and his family safe. Uh, so that's kind of how I see the big picture. There's this. He's a struggling person. He's struggling with these two things that conflict, and he thinks he should be able to go off and run away and do whatever he wants. It's kind of like a fantastical view of his life. And they portray it in the story as this fantasy, like it's a young boy's wild dreams. And then he grows up and he's becoming a man and he's learning what it means to be a responsible man. And his mother's trying to set him up with the young girl in town, and he's trying to figure out if he wants to be married. And he saved, like you say, he saves the pharmacist from making a terrible mistake, and he saves his brother. So he's, at the same time that he's talking about all these fantastical things he wants to do for himself, which we would think of as objectivists as like selfish or self-interested values. At the same time he's doing that, he's acting in the world to be a savior, to be responsible, and he's saving people, his brother and the pharmacist. And he needs to decide, does he want to be the savior of the town because his father dies and the building and loan business doesn't have a future if he doesn't stay in town and rescue it from the evil banker. So he's got to make a hard choice. So the film is about his struggle between these two desires and the hard choices he has to make in reality. And of course, I've said before, I think that the plot is very contrived. It's obviously contrived. And I think that's one of its strengths, is because it's making a moral point. It's really like a moral tale. And so you have to contrive the plot a lot, and it can't be like just completely naturalistic or realistic. So people pick it apart for having some ridiculous scenes or plot scenarios, but I think that they're particularly contrived to highlight the fact that George has this struggle and he has to face these certain problems and make the right choice.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things there, and I think we you know I there's this realization eventually that we all aren't going to be Henry Reardon or be the superstar. I mean, yeah, most boys who play high school football, by the time they're seniors, they realize that their football career is probably going to end by the time they graduate. But and I think George maybe comes to realize that there are circumstances that come into play that make you a superstar, or make you just the more common ordinary man. And there's also this real and I also get the impression too that some of these people see things in George that he doesn't quite see in himself. I mean, when Peter Bailey dies, in the movie, and he's running the building alone, and the men on the board are saying if you don't take over the building alone, they'll vote to dissolve it. And I think George is maybe thinking, can I run this building alone? And I said, well, these other men think you have the potential to run the building alone, George, even though you don't. And George takes it over, and I don't know exactly. And it looks like to me, at least Peter Bailey's family is somewhat well off. I mean, they do have a maid, so George wasn't poor growing up, but he wasn't. He certainly had a comfortable upbringing, although he weren't like on the level of Carnegie or Rockefeller. But that's what I saw in the movie, at least.
Yeah, he's not poor, but he gives a lot of his money away and invests it. So the thing is, he brings in a lot of money, but he puts it back into the community, right? That's one of the points of the whole story, is that when he does get money, he builds the new tract of houses that people can afford. He invests his money back into the building and loan during a run on the banks. And he, instead of going on his honeymoon, he puts that honeymoon money into his community by giving people the money that they come for when they're desperate, when there's that depression. I think it's during the Depression era. Yeah, so he doesn't live the high life. He tries to, what people see in him, what I think the community sees in him, is that he's actually about the community. He's about his family, but he's also struggling to be about himself. So they see him as a well-rounded person, but in his mind, he has these fantasies about what his life should be. And it takes him a while to grow out of that, because I don't think he really wanted that. Because the story, like Euron Brook would say, he should run off to Paris and pursue his flights of fancy. But this is a boy who was just dreaming things. When you're a boy, you have all kinds of fantasies. And yes, it kind of continues into his young adulthood, but he does kind of grow out of it. He really struggles with it, because obviously he's almost to the point of suicide. But I think when he decided he wanted to die, it was only because he feared like the damage he had done to his community, like he was going to do to his community and his family, because his brother lost all the money, the people's money that they were investing.
Well, Uncle Billy lost the money, yeah.
Yeah, so when his brother lost the money, he took on that responsibility himself, and he felt the weight of a future in shame and even in jail. He feared being thrown in jail for this. So he was at his lowest point, but it wasn't because he had not gone off to Paris and run away and saw the world and didn't fulfill his boyhood dreams. It was because of some failure in business and failure in responsibility.
Yeah. Let's clarify a few things out there for anybody who's listening, and especially if we have any younger people. A building and loan was like a bank, but there were differences, and it was also called a savings and loan, and those got really wiped out in the 80s, and now they're just all called banks. But it was a different organization where they'd loan out money to help people get homes and things like that, and in the movie, Uncle Billy loses $8,000, which in today's dollars would be about $122,000. So that gives you some significance of how much money was lost. Although still, even in this day and age, a bank would probably have more money, a lot more money in its deposits. But this is, we have several scenes, where there is a run on the bank, and there's the scene where George and Mary have their honeymoon money, and they see a bank run, and this is in the middle of the Depression, and they end up, using their honeymoon money to pay off all these depositors who want to get some money out of the bank because everybody's struggling at this point. And if you have William, I assume you probably as well had parents who or maybe grandparents who also experienced that era of American life, the Depression.
Oh, sure. Yeah, my family's been in this country for a long, long time. And the Depression hit everyone really hard. I think it's pretty accurately portrayed in the movie. I mean, I wasn't there, but I've read about it and heard about it from family members.
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah,
don't know if
so
we've ever had anything like that in America that's just been that bad since. I mean,
yeah, it's just you have to put yourself in their mindset. These depositors had invested their money in this company, which invests money in buildings. So when they come to the building and loan, and George Bailey tries to explain to them that all the money is tied up in these investments, they don't really care about that because they need money to buy food now, and
yes,
keep the heat on. So he feels for them, and he naturally tends to help people, and he gives them their money, or he gives them his money that he was going to spend on a honeymoon
yeah,
abroad. So again, it's like portrayed as his fantasy of a honeymoon in Paris or wherever they were going to go
yeah.
is squelched because of his responsibility to the community.
Yeah, and it is unfortunate because we don't ever get the impression that George ever does take those fantasies. I mean, and there's also that scene, where one guy walks into the building alone and says, "Hey, Potter's going to give us all 50 cents on the dollar. So, so if people had, $500 in the building alone, they could go to Potter and take their money and then their shares, and then they'd get 250." And they said, well, that's better than nothing, but it shows, of course, how Potter would later hold out and then still have the $500. So it'd be easy money for him, you
Yeah,
know?
well, Potter wants to
Yeah.
take over the whole town,
Yeah.
which is something that Bailey has vowed to stop.
Yeah.
Right? That's his whole purpose in staying in the town, is to save it from Potter.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think there's one thing too. We realize that there's no happiness in being, if you're in a room of 100 people and you're the one happy person. Can you really be happy when everybody else is sad? And can you really be happy in your wealth if everybody else is poor? I just don't see how that works. I mean, at least you would want the people around you to be happy and to have good lives. I mean,
Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the plot contrivances here, is that the whole town is suffering from this one banker.
yeah,
Um, I'm not sure that naturally happens in reality,
yeah,
but it's part of the story. It's a moral story. So you don't want to live in a miserable town if you're a happy, joyous person, and you can't live that way if your family or your community is suffering. It would become ultimately miserable for you, because
yeah,
you deal with people, you have friends, and if they're miserable all the time, then your life is going to be consumed by their misery.
yes. And this movie does also come from an era when banking was almost completely and totally localized. I mean, you might have the Bank of Minneapolis and the Bank of St. Paul, and they were not, they were two separate businesses or corporations. I mean, you didn't have the big mega banks that you have nowadays. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but and often the owner of the bank was the titan in his town. He was the big fish in the little pond, so to speak. Whereas now most of the banks, are just, you're, you may not really even have a truly community bank anymore. It's
Right. Well, it was harder to get around at that time, and I think the movie takes place in a kind of outskirts town. I think it's called
yeah,
Seneca Falls.
Bedford Falls.
Oh, Bedford Falls. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
they just made the name.
based on
Yeah,
Seneca Falls. Yeah.
yeah,
So Bedford Falls is a little distance from the main city, so it is you kind of have a rural feel to it. And they're by a big river, and that seems to be the hangout spot. So, um, there isn't a lot of action. People who want action, they have to go into the city. And I think one of his friends is an investor or something in New York or something in New York City, and so he occasionally will the city will come to him, but he never really gets to the city.
yeah. We get the impression that there are bigger and better things in the cities, and I've always been, there's always been what I call this exploitation element in Hollywood, where they're portraying people in small towns in a certain way, and while people in small towns are portrayed, and I don't know if they're ever really portrayed that positively. It seems like they try to. Hollywood has always kind of looked down on people who live in small towns, which I find unfortunate. But that's just, and I don't really, and I guess Bedford Falls was based on Seneca Falls. As far as I know, though, they don't ever really say what state it's in. But yeah, it seems like it is based on that. And although
Yeah,
Seneca,
that's another like aspect that turns it into this moral play or like mythical story. It's more like a fable, in my opinion.
yeah, and of course, Bedford. It's a Wonderful Life is also based on a short story called The Greatest Gift, so it wasn't a completely original thing, but which came out 3 years earlier. But yeah,
But the
so
whole city versus rural aspect to it
yeah,
also reminds me of another aspect you told me you like about my evaluation, and that's the connection to Tom Sawyer. Because Tom Sawyer is portrayed as a wild boy, and there's this idea of civilizing the wild man, like
yes,
taming the wild nature of the boy. And I think that's a big theme going on in both Tom Sawyer and It's a Wonderful Life. And the connection is not merely abstract. There's scenes in the movie where the angel is reading Tom Sawyer, and then in the end, he gives the book to George Bailey.
yes, indeed. I found that, and I think the small town city contrast, is the character of Sam Wainwright, who in the beginning is also much more interested in Mary Hatch than George is. It almost seems like Mary picked George more than George picked Mary, but Sam Wainwright goes out and invests in plastics and apparently does do quite well for himself. But Sam never forgets his roots, and he never forgets his friends back in Bedford Falls. And it is interesting also toward the end. There's this telegram that comes in, and it says my office has been instructed to advance you $25,000. Sincerely, Sam Wainwright. I mean, you get the impression, you finally realize, oh, Sam does like George. It's but it's
Yeah, that's one of the things that that's another one of the things I like about the movie is that there are these rich people in the movie who have made a success with money, and they're not portrayed as evil. Like you're saying, Sam is a good person who comes to the aid of his community and his friend, whereas Henry Potter is portrayed as the villain, but not necessarily because he has money. It's because of his vicious character. So And I think he needs to be a powerful person in town to be a powerful villain. And so
Yeah,
they make him, so the whoever wrote the story made him a banker with a lot of money. But his what makes him a villain is that he's not a good person. He when when the brother of George, is it Billy Bailey? When
Billy is not his brother. Billy's his uncle. Billy is the brother of Peter Bailey.
I'm sorry. Yeah, his uncle Billy Bailey, when he loses the money and it happens to fall into Potter's hands, Potter doesn't return it, even though he knows whose money it is. He
Yeah,
keeps it. He's
yeah,
he's a vicious person, and it's a lot of money, and he knows it's going to break George,
yeah.
so that's why he keeps it.
And although it's kind of contrived in the modern world, how would you account? Back then, it probably wouldn't have been hard, but how would you account for this money just appearing on your books? I mean,
Yeah,
eventually, I think eventually, if something like that does come up, Potter would have gotten caught. I
oh,
don't, I don't,
yeah,
I don't know how that. I assume Potter had accountants or had auditors or had people who went through his books to make sure he was, paying his income tax and all that stuff. And they'd say, Mr. Potter, where'd this $8,000 come from? And being in a small town like that, they probably would quickly make the connection and realize, oh, it does bring up the one question too is, why would you entrust that kind of money just to one person? Because you couldn't ever imagine somebody walking around with $100,000 in their pocket, and that's basically what we're told that Uncle Billy was doing in this movie. Because adjusted for inflation, it's a very substantial amounts of money. But that'd
yeah.
be
I don't know if you'd send a couple people to make the deposit
yeah,
or not, but
yeah,
I think that George trusted his uncle. His uncle hadn't made such a mistake before, although I think he is portrayed as kind of a clumsy person.
yeah. He's
Um,
definitely portrayed as a bumbler. You do wonder where his what his deal is. And it's
yeah,
interesting too that as great as this movie is, they don't really do that much to make them. They all look like they're the same age, even though we have a fairly wide range here of when George is in high school, he looks the same as he does when he's toward the end of the movie. But that's just we're just being nitpicky on that. But obviously, you have your suspension of disbelief. But I don't really get the impression that Henry Potter is a happy character in this movie. He seems like he's a pretty warped, frustrated old man, as George calls him, and he's still portrayed as that. And I don't, and it seems like the only closest thing to friend has had is he has that minion that pushes him around in the wheelchair too. And that's another thing too is they made a villain in a wheelchair. It's
yeah. He's not the super healthy, athletic hero or villain.
yeah,
He's, like you might see in a Marvel movie, but I think he's a better portrayal of a villain because he physically embodies like you know bad qualities
yeah.
or negative qualities.
Yeah, and I don't know. I suppose considering the time the movie was made, it might have been more common just to see people in wheelchairs because of polio. It's or things like that. Maybe that's uh, who knows. It might have even been a backhanded slam on FDR at the time. Why they had Potter in a wheelchair, but I do find that to be an interesting thing in the movie. My dad used to say that Lionel Barrymore absolutely hated himself in that movie. Lionel Barrymore portrays Potter.
Yeah, well, he was a good actor. He
Oh yeah, yeah. He was a. I mean, that's
As
going.
for why he was in a wheelchair, I think they might have put him in a wheelchair so that he could exert more control over somebody. So
Yeah,
like now he can, instead of pulling himself around, he can order somebody else to push him around, to push his wheelchair around. So he
yeah.
needs
Whereas,
he needs another minion
Yeah, I mean, he needs another minion. He's like, like that guy's his version of Smithers, and he's Monty Burns. Uh, yeah, and the only other thing too, I'm looking and thinking, hey, why are you complaining, George? You got with Donna Reed. I mean, this was when, I mean, Donna Reed was a dream at the time. I mean, I think that's she plays that role so well. You just look at the eyes and my dad absolutely my dad loved them both. He loved Donna Reed and he loved Jimmy Stewart. So I think that's why certainly why Dad introduced me to that movie.
I think that's when Hollywood
Yeah,
valued beautiful actresses and put them in the lead.
I think Hollywood had different values then, although it seemed like to me they were always trying to push things in a certain direction, but they just weren't completely off the deep end like they are today. And finally, I think we've got to comment on the fact that all of these people, I don't know how long the time period is from when Uncle Billy loses the money to when George comes back from the bridge. I don't know. I mean, in real time, we'll say, what is it, maybe 3, 4 hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours. I don't know. Do we know exactly how long it is in the movie that takes place?
I think it is a matter of hours.
Yeah.
We could probably figure it out, but I'm not sure if it matters.
I,
It's the same night, right?
I think the significant thing here, though, William, is that all of this was accomplished without Facebook, without GoFundMe, without social media, without smartphones. It was all done with just landline telephones and people running around town and telegrams. And I mean,
Right.
and the snow's coming down, and Harry Bailey even comes into town and says, "I heard my brother George was in trouble." And I, and the best moment, without a doubt, is to my big brother George, the richest man in town.
Yeah, that's part of the sentimentality I talked about before, is that the movie is very sentimental. And if you don't get on board with that sentimentality, you might come out with a negative view of the movie because you think it's cheesy or it's overly contrived and you don't understand, you don't really like accept the contrivances or why it's contrived.
Yeah, and
But yeah, his brother telling him, he's the richest man in town, that's just it's a powerful statement about what it means to be rich, like rich in money or rich in spirit or rich in community. That's a powerful concept. And I think that's one of the ideas that the movie is really exploring is what makes you, uh, a rich person. I think maybe another term for it is, a valued person. Like riches are values. And so it's really at the core of the movie. It's about the most the person with the most values.
there's definitely a case where George has his values, and of course you see his 4 kids. I mean, they all just seem like normal kids, and I think when the another minor plot device is when he gets mad because his one little girl gets kind of sick on her way walking home, and then of course the husband sees him in the bars and hits him, and George's friend says, "Get out of here." It's there. That's another interesting scene where everybody, but it also kind of shows how small towns, in a way, govern themselves and how we all regulate ourselves in a small town. I mean, if you do something, somebody's going to find out, and it may seem annoying that everybody knows everybody's business, but it also makes it harder to get away with things. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with relationships and your attachments and responsibility to your friends and your family and everything. It's trying to portray his community as a connected whole,
yeah,
and he's the kind of leader of it, and the one who keeps it together and prevents it from falling into the hands of Henry Potter. Because one of the things, the main thing that the angel Clarence does is he shows George what the town would be like if he were never born.
Yes.
And it's terrible because his brother would have fallen through the ice and died. His employer at the pharmacy would have sent the wrong medication and killed his client, his customer.
Yeah.
Henry Potter would have taken over the town and turned it into Las Vegas.
Pottersville.
Yeah. Yeah, gambling and strip
Yeah.
joints and everything. Yeah, so
Yeah, it's interesting to see how that how the other character ends up, that the other woman, that Violet character, if you remember in the pharmacy, she says, "Help me off the stool,"
yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah, and so he wouldn't have saved individuals, and especially he wouldn't have saved Mary. Mary would have become this lonely, not unmarried woman without a family. So it's a sad portrayal. Of course, this is all part of the contrived plot, but it's contrived to make a powerful moral statement.
Yeah, it does make a powerful moral statement, Also, I think we've got to, another thing you can't forget about that movie is just the house where they go and restore the house, and you get this great running gag though, that every time George goes up the steps, he puts his hand on that knob, and he always realizes that he still has the knob in his hand, and so he has to put the knob back on the banister.
Yeah, and the squeaky step.
Yeah, and you always laugh. I mean, you realize that George, and George by a lot of standards is pretty well, but he still has those same things to deal with that we all kind of have to deal with in life. It's
kind of about a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
He's, in the beginning when he's focused on his fantasies, unfulfilled fantasies, he looks at things in a negative light and doesn't appreciate the fact that he's just there experiencing everything. And then in the end, when he's had his transformation in thought, he starts having a positive orientation, and he loves his house. Everything about his house and everything about his family is good, because it's there. And the squeaky step doesn't bother him, and the doorknob doesn't bother him.
Yes, it's and there was another thing too that was pointed out in an article on LouRockwell.com, is that for a while It's a Wonderful Life got into the public domain, and that's part of what's made it somewhat of a classic, is because all these TV stations could show it as a Christmas movie, and they didn't have to worry about the royalties, and that's maybe what made it more of a helped it grow and made it bigger, because curiously enough, the budget was 3.18 million, and the box office was only 3.3 at the time. It really was not by any means it was just a break-even movie. It didn't really become a hit or a classic until later. And I remember the TV show Blossom. There's this scene in one of their Christmas episodes where the father keeps changing the channel and says, and you keep hearing on the TV, says, "And now we'll get back to It's a Wonderful Life." And then he changes the station again, says, "And now we continue with It's a Wonderful Life." And he keeps changing stations, making fun of the fact that It's a Wonderful Life is on every TV station. So because of the copyright issues, it went into, it wasn't renewed in 1974. And then, but
in 1946, so this was, war years, post-war years, or during the war.
Yeah.
And maybe people weren't so interested in going to this Wonderful Life movie.
Yeah.
I don't really know the history of why it failed at the box office. Yeah. But I'm sure it had to do with some generational thing. And then when the children of the war era when they started watching it on TV, maybe they had a completely different context for it.
That's hard to say, really. Why it would do well and do well later. I mean, NBC got exclusive rights to it in '94, and to their credit, they also still show it in black and white, which I certainly appreciate because it was originally made in black and white. I don't see any reason to make movies in black and white now, but if the movie was made in black and white, I appreciate that it's kept that way. I don't know if that's sometimes, William, I just wonder if this is maybe because even the younger generation sees a life that was maybe a little bit simpler, and they maybe romanticize about that a little bit, because it definitely seems like to give a picture of an America that I think was probably a lot healthier than the America that we have today, an America that doesn't seem to exist anymore. It's, you know, an America that valued family, and also too, it is an America where it seemed like police officers were much more part of the community, and not really seen in this adversarial relationship. The cop Bert, he knows, Bert knows everybody in town, and it's, you can even see in Pottersville's that the police officers seem to have a more adversarial relationship with the community. I wonder maybe if part of the growth of that is just because it portrays this America that simply does not exist anymore.
Yeah, I think it might have something to do with nostalgia as well. Uh, I think it has to do a lot with the, just this distribution that you can get on TV as well. So I think it's a combination of factors.
Yeah.
Like it's when when you repeatedly see something, you see more details about it, and you learn to appreciate it more. So there's a lot of different factors that go into people as a whole in America realizing that this is a great movie, and it should be watched every year.
Yeah, I've noticed when I watch a movie the third or the fourth time, or after that, I start to notice these little things in it that I didn't notice, and just how those little subtle things really do set the tone for the movie. I mean, and Capra was certainly considered a brilliant director in his time. And you also realize, that, and also realizing, that some of the lesser actors in the movie also showed up in other lesser roles in other movies. I mean, I don't, I do remember hearing, I think, an interview with one of the actors who played the kids, because I think some of the kids in that movie are still alive, but there aren't that many people left from It's a Wonderful Life, unfortunately.
I think the woman who played the daughter is alive or was recently still alive.
Yeah, I think there was a movie with one of them on Patrick Coffin, who's a very who's a conservative Christian, and certainly this movie, I think, very much appeals to conservative Christians because it does have a very positive religious message. But and maybe that's part of what Iran doesn't like either, because it's somewhat religious and somewhat sentimental. But even taking out the religious message, the question of seeing what the world would be like if you'd never been born is certainly something we all get, and this is also a theme that has been done over many times. Married with Children did a Christmas episode once where Al Bundy is actually shown by an angel who's actually Sam Kinison about what the world would look like if Al Bundy had never been born. And the final episode of Dallas is a 2-hour show of actually an angel who turns out to be actually Satan, but showing J.R. Ewing what the world would have been like if J.R. Ewing had never been born.
There's two great plot devices in Christmas, in some of the more popular Christmas movies, like A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life. On one hand, an angel shows you what the world would be like without you, to kind
Yeah.
of put the point, to focus your attention on how valuable you are to your community, which is what's being done in
Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Life. And then there's the Christmas Carol, where angels come and show you your history and your future and the present, and all of that is really to show you how important you are as well. So even though Yaron Brook takes exception to some of the elements in It's a Wonderful Life, I think he should appreciate that those supernatural elements are a plot contrivance or plot device to
Yeah.
highlight individuality and the importance of an individual.
Yeah, and I definitely, I definitely think in It's a Wonderful Life, there's definitely a Scrooge Cratchit thing going here. There's definitely a similarities between the two characters. I mean, the greedy old man at Christmas time. It's uh, and as you made the Tom Sawyer connection, too, like when you think of Becky Thatcher and Tom Sawyer, Mary Hatch, and there was a character named Mary also in Tom Sawyer. I think that's a great.
Well, there was his cousin, I believe it was his cousin
Yeah.
in Tom Sawyer, was named Mary, and she was kind of the religious influence on him. And so there's these characters named Mary, who's obviously which is obviously a reference to Mary in the Bible, because Christmas is about a birth of the newborn king,
Yes.
and the mother is Mary, and she's revered as this pure, wholesome family woman who's devoted to her son. And there are characters in Tom Sawyer and It's a Wonderful Life who are named Mary and have this sort of wholesome womanhood to them, and they are the desirable wife and mother to cherished children. And there are also some other name connections, like there are two potters. So in Tom Sawyer, there's a grave robber named Muff Potter, and in It's a Wonderful Life, the villain is Henry Potter. So there's all kinds of these little detailed references to Tom Sawyer that
Yeah.
if you pick apart what's going on in It's a Wonderful Life, you'll find them. They both live in towns next to a river. A river is very important in Tom Sawyer and also in It's a Wonderful Life. So there's also themes that are connected to both stories.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, and I think the guy who plays Clarence really does a great job too. I mean, that's just so the whole angel second class, and I, yeah, I don't think you have to be religious at all to appreciate the message of It's a Wonderful Life. But sometimes I wonder if maybe objectivists just don't, they just don't seem to like sentimental things, and maybe that's the problem here. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of valuing of family in the objectivist movement, which I think is really a big problem. It's like, what are you supposed to do? You're just supposed to, be alone when you die and not have kids. I mean, that doesn't seem like seems kind of like a sad way to go, if you ask me.
Well, in this case, I think it has a lot to do with Euron's interpretation of the movie, and he didn't really go after the sentimentality. I don't
Yeah.
recall. His main issue is with George Bailey not fulfilling his self-interest. So
Yeah.
it's more about the self-interest versus sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake. I think if you dig deeper, it's the movie is not really about that. So I think he had a wrong take or a misguided take. And of course, he influences a lot of objectivists or people who follow Ayn Rand. And so that's kind of spread. But if you talk to a lot of objectivists, they like the movie, and
Yeah.
the sentimentality doesn't bother them.
And there's another thing too. When Potter offers him that job, and Potter's trying to, really trying to wipe out the building alone that way. We don't know if George would have kept that job. Potter might have, giving him that job, and then waited till the building and loan was out of business, and then fired George. I mean, I think that was certainly the.
Well, I don't know if he would have fired him, but he would have tried to grind him down. So Potter was about controlling things. He wants to control the town. He wants to control George Bailey. He wanted to control his father, Peter Bailey, and he wanted to control George Bailey, the son. So I think Potter is about control, in centralizing control. And then George Bailey is about working with people, cooperating, and letting people have their own freedom in their own domain. He doesn't want to control them. He wants to work with people and build a healthy community. So that, I think that's where it is. And if George had gone to work for Potter, I think that story would be about George losing his soul, George becoming the minion of
Henry Potter.
Henry Potter, sorry.
Yeah, so anyway, this leads us into some other directions, too. I do wonder, what does, if somebody's an atheist or an objectivist, what do they do at Christmas? I mean,
well, I'll tell you what I do.
or even just not be Christian. I mean, I know people still give the gifts, and holidays do tend to take on a life of their own now, especially Christmas has. But what?
Well, for me, Christmas has become about goodwill. So one of the main themes of a lot of secular Christmas movies, like Die Hard, or even Trading Places, there's this theme about rebirth, rejuvenation, innocence, goodwill, helping people, saving people. So it's not all about Christ being born, but a lot of the themes that are in the secular Christmas now come from the story of Jesus, because Jesus was the son of a virgin, which is like purity and innocence. And also babies are symbols of purity and innocence. And of course, Jesus was the savior. So you don't have to be a supernatural deity to be a savior. You can be John McClane from Die Hard.
Yeah, exactly. You certainly can be. I think there's certainly a lot of themes of rebirth. I think, it does bother me sometimes that growing up in a Catholic school, you never hear those songs in church anywhere else. The songs that you hear in church,
like hymns.
The hymns, yeah. You never. I mean, they're never any. I mean, and It's a Wonderful Life. You actually do hear them. The girl actually is playing "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," but I don't know how. I'm very mixed about what I call the secularization of Christmas, because it just seems like it's like Christmas exists just for its own sake now.
Well, Christmas, in my understanding, used to be a pagan winter festival.
Yeah.
So it used to celebrate the beginning of a new year.
Yeah. And, and of course, being close to the coming right after the winter solstice, I think that's also a part of it. But, it's funny. It's funny how a holiday nowadays takes on a life of its own. I wonder how many people know what Cinco de Mayo is about. And Cinco de Mayo is actually, the celebration of a victory in the Battle of Puebla by Mexico on the 5th of May in 1862. It's like, but it's like does anybody really know what this holiday means anymore? But it's, and I don't know if Christmas has quite become that, but it seems like Christmas is on its way to becoming something like that.
There is this struggle with what should we celebrate.
Yeah.
At the beginning of a new year, at the end of a year, it's a transition period. and there's a struggle between religions and between atheists and religionists. So you have Hanukkah, you have um, Christmas, you have other festive, winter celebrations. Um, so I think there is this struggle, like what should a culture celebrate as a culture? Um, but if you're a product of many cultures like America, then you're going to have many different celebrations. So you're going to have a more secular or pagan type ritual, and then you're going to have the religious rituals. So I think as long as we don't start shooting each other over these rituals, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
All of it will mix together over time, and you might get a new like integrated or misintegrated even ritual or that combines a lot of these things.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, there is another clue as to where Bedford Falls is. When George and Mary are coming, they're coming from that prom, or is it from the dance or something? They're singing that song, Buffalo Gals, won't you come out tonight? Come out tonight. Come out tonight.
Right.
Apparently that actually is a reference to Buffalo. So they're at least supposed to be close to Buffalo,
Oh, I see.
which of course ties in with the snow because Buffalo gets a whole lot more snow than New York City does. So
Yeah, I'm not familiar with all the cities. Is Seneca Falls near Buffalo?
I don't really know, but apparently that minstrel would vary from town to town. Like in Boston, it would be Boston gals, and
Oh, okay.
Chicago would be Chicago gals because it's easier.
Well, I
Of course,
definitely think that it's supposed to be in New York somewhere.
yeah, yeah, somewhere in New York. So you know, I the I sometimes I do wonder if we have a need for certain rituals and if rituals help us get through life. I mean, rituals like Christmas, because Christmas does seem to be something that at least brings out some positive things in people. So you see certain qualities and personalities emerge. I mean, uh, I, you know, I'm actually, I lost my oldest brother back in June, and and he was the most fanatical Christmas person I knew. I mean, he would have went around every house and decorated it if he could have. He
Hmm.
loved to put trees up. He loved putting lights up, and he just loved to do that.
Yeah, well, that's part of being alive, acting and doing things and behaviors, and you want to share some of that with people. I think, humans are social animals, and we build communities. And I think rituals are important because they give you something to do with other people, and it's a shared knowledge and acceptance of everyone's behavior. So it's kind of teaching you to be part of a community, by having the set of rituals that you do together. And I don't think you can not do these if you're in a community. Even if you don't do Christmas, you might do some other holiday. There's a ton of them. You might on Memorial Day, you might remember, that your veterans and soldiers or whatever. And you do that together. Maybe you go to a party and celebrate. On New Year's, maybe you don't like Christmas, you do New Year's and you have, the streamers and the champagne. And so all of these holidays, they have their set of actions and maybe words too, like you're talking about the hymns, but there's also secular Christmas songs. So maybe every year you look forward to your set of rituals that you enjoy, and that keeps you connected to your community, maybe even a nation.
Yeah, it definitely does, of course, and of course, just ritual. Your language is part of the rituals. I mean, you can't live it. I mean, if you're in a city of 100 people and everybody speaks English and you don't speak English, you're going to have a problem. I mean, there's always a certain amount I hate saying it, conformity involved, but the rituals, and you might be, that's one thing I kind of, I just scratch my head. For example, every once in a while, I'll see this sign up that says, "Oh, Christmas lights installed. Call us." As like, why, if you don't want to put up your Christmas lights, then don't put up your Christmas lights. But why would you ever hire somebody to do that? I mean, it's like, if you, I mean, we always put up Christmas lights because we enjoyed doing it. We didn't.
You mean on the house or on the
On
tree?
the yeah, people do it on the house or on the tree, but you actually see people nowadays. They'll apparently, they'll do it as a job. It's like, if you want to do that as a job, that's great. But why, if you, I mean, if why would I would never pay somebody to put up Christmas lights is my whole point. If I want to do it, I'll do it myself. If I don't want to do it, I won't do it.
Well, my dad always put up the Christmas lights himself, and I put them
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
So I understand where you're coming from, but think of people who maybe physically can't do it, or people who are not that into that aspect of the ritual, but they do like the lights. So everyone picks the qualities of a holiday that they enjoy. Maybe they have a fear of heights and don't want to get on a ladder. I don't know, but I wouldn't I wouldn't put someone down just because they don't put up their lights. I think it's important that they do want to put up the lights in the first place, and I wouldn't look too deeply into why they don't put them up themselves.
My fear is that it's just one of those things, like keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, is what I'm afraid of. Is that it's some type of virtue signaling or something like that. But anyway, I
Well,
could.
it could be that, could not, maybe it's not that. If it's important to you, I would have a discussion with that person and ask them,
Yeah,
hey, have you ever considered putting up your own lights, or,
I've
what's going on there?
never. Yeah, I mean, certainly my brother did it for the. Certainly, my brother did it for the. Did it for my. Certainly put trees up in my parents' house and things like that.
Maybe it's a part of their goodwill, actually. Maybe they want to pay someone money, give them a job, so it's part of it could be conceived as another goodwill aspect of a community. It's like you're hiring people, you're making jobs,
Yeah,
and you're interacting. Maybe you're lonely and you want to hire people to come over to your house to do tasks and have company.
yeah, yeah. This brings me to some other things, that I think are telling about Christmas. I mean, I don't know if there's anything else particularly stand out for you at Christmas that you enjoy watching. I mean, certainly, it certainly seems like the movie A Christmas Story has become another movie that's embedded in the culture. And I can say I actually do remember going to the theater and seeing that movie in 1983. It was certainly a hilarious. I didn't imagine it would take on a life of its own, but I can certainly understand why it has.
Well, I actually read something recently that said a Christmas movie isn't about the setting, it's about the message. So It's a Wonderful Life is a Christmas movie, but A Christmas Story is not, because A Christmas Story is about this boy who wants a certain toy, and it's not really about the themes of Christmas,
Yeah,
other than wanting a particular gift.
and I think sometimes it also ties in with a lot of those things that we have to deal with at Christmas, where he has to deal with it. And one relative who always gets him gifts that he hates, and other things like that. And of course, A Christmas Story is also another movie that is a throwback to a certain time. I mean, it actually even whereas It's a Wonderful Life was made in 1946, and apparently takes place in 1946. A Christmas Story, it looks like it goes back to the late 30s, which, and I think it's just, the fact that it's a very G-rated movie and you have a lot of little funny gags happening, like who can ever forget the lamp, and
Yeah.
of course when the dad keeps going up to the electrical outlet where you have all these things plugged into the electrical outlet and just it's all kind of just
Yeah, it's kind of based on jokes.
yeah yeah
So, even I like the what was it?
yes
Drink your Ovaltine,
yes
the coded message.
yes.
That always cracked me up.
And by the way, also let's remember this is not Peter Billingsley's only acting claim to fame. He also did the Messy Marvin commercials for Hershey's chocolate milk mix. He did a lot of those commercials that if you watch Saturday morning cartoons back in those areas, you saw those commercials all the time. So before he was Ralphie, he was Messy Marvin. But anyway, but yeah, but the Ovaltine does tie in with the chocolate milk though. So, yeah.
Have you seen the sequel? They just made a new Christmas Story.
I have not seen that, but I definitely do want to see that. I can imagine it to be very interesting. It's this sort of reminds me of some other Christmas shows or specials out there. I think that have certainly going back to the connection with Scrooge. I think I often wonder what inspired Dickens to write that story, because I think that was a very interesting story for its time. Do you know, by the way, what did Rand think of Dickens? Did she ever say anything about Dickens? I suspect she probably hated Dickens, but
As far as I know, I don't recall if she had an opinion on Dickens. She probably thought well, I don't want to say, but in my view, he's a little naturalistic. He's more of a naturalist than the writer of It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, well, there always seemed to be this theme of portraying what was really wrong with the world, and I don't know if Dickens was trying to say we're all helpless against these things that are wrong, or if somehow the government should get involved and solve these problems. But I do find A Christmas Carol to be definitely one of the more unique Christmas stories you'll ever out there, and it seems to have taken on its life its own too. And of course, that's another story that's been done. There's been so many versions of that story done. I mean, the Muppet Christmas Carol, the cartoon versions. I mean,
what's interesting about all the different versions is that it's such a powerful story to begin with that you can't really mess around with the characters too much, or else it doesn't work. So you have Scrooge, and you have Cratchit, and then you have the ghosts. So of past, present, and future. So it's everyone's kind of familiar with the core of the story, and all the different versions all they can really add to it is little details and nuances.
Yeah, well, maybe for example, you could take this story out of England and put it into maybe Argentina or Chile or Peru or Southeast Asia or something like that. But yeah, you can't really do a whole lot with it. But you can, and maybe change the era also. You can take it out of that era and put it in current present day, or even take it back. I mean,
yeah, but the story structure is so structured, and it too, I would argue that it too is very contrived. That you have to maintain that structure. Like you can't really start with the future and then end with the past.
Oh yeah,
it has to go in a particular order.
I think there are some versions where sometimes he's visited by past and then present and then future, but then some cases he's visited by present, then past, then future. One of the more, it's interesting too. I mentioned to you that I was introduced to that story by the Mr. Magoo version, which was a cartoon TV special that was it actually aired in 1962. It was at least as far as Wikipedia is concerned, it was the first animated Christmas special made for television. I mean, it was before anything else. And Mr. Magoo is an actor who's starring in a musical version of the story. So Mr. Magoo ends up playing Scrooge, and of course, you have the various jokes with Mr. Magoo and his vision and all that stuff. But
I think his general character. I'm not too familiar with Mr. Magoo, but he's got his eyes shut half the time.
Yeah.
So I think that works with Scrooge, because it's really about Scrooge having blinders onto his place in the world and the value he has to people.
And of course, also there's the connection with Mr. Magoo was voiced by Jim Backus, who also was Mr. Howell on Gilligan's Island. So so
yeah.
I don't know if that was intentional, but there's the bless his heart, if you remember what Mr. Howell was like. I mean, he was certainly in his own little world.
Yeah, he was a rich man who was concerned with material things.
Yeah, he was
kind of aloof.
Yeah. So anyway, I think also certainly sometimes I wonder too, where what influenced Dr. Seuss to write The Grinch. It seems like The Grinch is another story where you're realizing that Christmas really isn't just about presents, and Christmas is still about just getting together and singing songs, which is what the Who's end up doing, even though don't have their decorations and their presents.
Well, maybe Seuss thought, what is the opposite of a holly jolly Christmas? And he thought a grumpy Grinch type Christmas. So the Grinch is just a character that has massive potential for change.
Yeah, there's his heart. He had a heart that was 2 sizes too small, and then his heart grew 2 sizes that day.
But he's really a Scrooge-like character, right? He's got a negative view of the world.
Yeah, and the brilliance of Seuss is that he was able to, draw a character. You watch the cover, and you see the cover of that book, and you see the Grinch, and you just know he's the villain. You can tell just by the sight of him. And of course,
but I like these stories where your protagonist starts off as the villain and then becomes the hero in the end.
Yeah, and then becomes at least redeems himself to a certain extent. And of course, you can't. And of course, that special would not work without and Boris Karloff narrating. Perfect. I mean,
yeah.
By then you take a long, almost retired, horror movie actor, and you make him the narrator of the movie. I don't think anybody could have done it better, though. I mean,
but I think this idea of transformation, or radical transformation, is essentially a Christmas theme, because that's what Jesus does.
Yeah.
He's goes from being, part of God to coming down and becoming a man.
Yeah.
And then in the end, he's sacrificed and becomes a spirit again. So it's this theme of transcendence and transformation and change that's critical to the Christmas story.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a plot element or a character plot element in many stories, but I think it's essential to the Christmas story.
Yeah, and even say a movie like Home Alone, which I think has this whole theme of, oh my God, we left our kid home alone, and we didn't, we weren't paying attention, and we just completely forgot him, and then the family comes back and gets him, and Suddenly there's more of a, there's a certain amount of redemption there too. I think that's what maybe has made Christianity so powerful, is there's always this, you can always get redemption. And I'd love to know if objectivism offers something like that. And I don't really know if it does. And maybe that's one thing that has made Christianity so powerful, that it does give us a chance at redemption.
Well, objectivism believes in free will. Ayn
Yeah.
Rand was a strong proponent of free will and improving yourself and change. So I definitely think that objectivism uh, would agree with that. Would say that if you're not doing the right thing now, it's within your power and your self-control to change and become good. Um, most people aren't born an objectivist, so most people are either born into a Christian or religious family, or maybe an atheist sort of Marxist slash Kantian family, or wherever you come from on the secular side. But very few children are born into an objectivist family. So I came from a Protestant family, and I transitioned into an atheist and objectivist. So if you see faith as not ideal in terms of coming to not objective knowledge or truth, and you see logic and reason and common sense as that path towards becoming a good, knowledgeable person, then objectivism is totally on board with that transition.
Yes, indeed. Where do you think we always have this need for redemption? If you look at little kids, I think little kids can be apologetic, but I don't think they wallow in their mistakes. They seem to know how to move on from our mistakes. And maybe it seems like as we get older, we tend to maybe have more tendency to ruminate over our mistakes. And that's maybe why as adults, we're not as happy as kids are. Or I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, kids are focused on living, finding things. They want more ice cream, they want chocolate, they want to go to the park and play. It's always about what they want, which is to some degree a healthy orientation. And then when you get older, there are some philosophies and religions that teach you to suppress your self-interest and focus on doing good for others or loving your enemies, or things like that, and it becomes a confused mess. And so you get people who struggle, like George Bailey. They struggle with conflicting ideas, and they actually become like mixed people in terms of values and philosophy. And it's not always clear, which idea is right, because you do have this culture that has religious elements and secular elements. So I think it does take a lot of reflection. And you talk about redemption, and I think recall, like recollection and thinking about your past, and regretting your mistakes is very important. A lot of these Christmas stories we've been talking about, they involve, memory, going back and looking upon your past, or thinking about how you interact with people and your place in the community, just reflecting on your life, and you can't really change unless you reflect on who you are and who you have been, and then do something different in the future. You have to learn from your mistakes so that you don't repeat your history, at least the history that you don't like.
Yeah. We mentioned a few things now. Is there anything else for you that really stands out at Christmas that's really worth remembering? Any movies or anything in particular? I think we've covered a lot of them right so far.
Um, I like a lot of Christmas movies. You know, I talked about It's a Wonderful Life on a previous podcast because I do think it's
Yeah.
one of the better Christmas movies. If we're going to integrate the religious and secular elements of Christmas, I think It's a Wonderful Life does a good job of that. It doesn't overwhelm you with the religious aspect and it doesn't overwhelm you with the secular aspect, but it involves both. And I think to some degree, the thing with the angel Clarence is just a plot device, kind of like a time machine is a plot device to get
Yeah.
people into the past or into the future. Well, the angel Clarence is just a plot device to show us a world without George Bailey.
Yeah.
And it doesn't shove the religious angle into your face. It's not about, oh, Jesus was the greatest person and you should do everything he did. You should act like Jesus and all that. It's really just a
Yeah.
it's just a he's the angel Clarence begins on a shot of a star, and
Yeah.
it tries to portray him as this star. So
Yeah.
it's not even really a spirit. You know, it's also an integration of a physical object like a star and
Yeah.
saying, hey, look, there's a spirit in the star.
Yeah.
So
And I like the fact, that Clarence is also portrayed as not being perfect himself. I mean, they said I have to earn my wings, and helping George is Clarence's way of getting his wings. He
yeah.
says I'm an angel second class. It's like, and I just think that's, there's another thing too. I just thought of, when when Clarence and George are in the bar and George is calling Nick by his name, although Nick doesn't know he is, and George even says, "Well, that's your name, isn't it?" And then I notice he's throwing him out, and they throw them out, and he calls them pixies, and I'm wondering, was that a word for somebody who was gay? I couldn't look that up, but I wondered where that word came from. It just made me wonder. But maybe that's not really important, but
I don't really know. I didn't focus on that aspect
yeah,
of the scene.
just something I observed. The way because they throw them out of the bar because they seem like they're rather odd, but they're not really doing anything disruptive. But it wasn't. But it was really there to show just how the attitude of the town had changed because everybody just seemed like they were a lot angrier and they weren't as happy and friendly.
Yeah, I think they weren't. I mean, religious people would call it compassion,
Yeah,
but I think it's mostly just a lack of empathy.
yeah,
They don't. uh, They're bothered, so it's more about their orientation, right? Not
yeah,
they used to be friendly and positive,
yeah,
and now that Potter's running the town, the whole town has become negative, and they're bothered by this person, and so that's why they get all irritated by George when they don't recognize him
yeah,
and boot him out of the
yeah.
establishment.
And George is still living in this world where he knows everybody, but nobody knows who he is, and it doesn't quite occur to him, that this is he doesn't seem to believe what's happening. It,
Yeah, because who would? It's a
yeah,
radical change. He wasn't told that it was going to happen.
yeah, and then of course there's even that there's also that theme too. Is that we didn't even mention it yet, but you know I can't there aren't that many. I mentioned earlier that Married with Children did a Christmas episode one time where Al Bundy was shown a world where he wasn't alive, and of course that was a reverse because everybody was actually happier with Al Bundy. But I also remember an episode uh, of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that if you've never watched Buffy, you might not get the episode by itself, but it deals with this whole theme of redemption as well. And I think it just uh, in 120, I think in 144 episodes, I think that was the only Christmas episode they did in 7 seasons. But it was just I found it to be a masterpiece just because it dealt with the whole theme of redemption and it didn't necessarily portray Christmas as being this perfect holiday for everybody. I mean,
Yeah, well, so I recently watched this episode because you mentioned it to me, and I saw a couple different themes. There's also obviously there's the redemption arc because the one of the main characters is a vampire named Angel,
yeah,
and he has this bad past where he's killed people and done evil things as a vampire, and he's fighting his urge to kill Buffy, and but in this story, Buffy is the hero, so she's the vampire slayer, and she figures out something important, and it's that there's this group of witches or something that are controlling Angel,
yeah,
and she has to disrupt their rituals of control, and then try to convince Angel that he now has the control and he can change himself.
yeah. Yeah, Buffy deals with a lot of these episodes of free will versus non-free will, and it's basically said that angels given a soul, and vampires aren't supposed to have souls, and that's the whole thing. Is that if you don't have a soul, you don't have a conscience, therefore you can't be anything but evil. But I also always found Buffy to be well done because there was this very clear there was usually generally a very clear boundary of who is good and who is evil. Buffy is good and the people on her side are good, and it was never really particularly ambiguous about that. But I also find it interesting too that you have this theme with Xander sleeping outside because his family is having their annual Christmas fight, and it's just this realization that maybe Christmas and family isn't necessarily all that happy for everyone. It's
Yeah, I noticed that too. I
yeah,
think that's another theme that I detected, is that there's this idea of separation. So not only is there community, and so in a lot of these stories, like A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life, community and getting together is a big theme, but the opposite of that is separation. And so you have Angel being separated from Buffy and even his own soul. He feels like he's got a conflict within himself. And then you have the separation with Xander and his family, and you have separations elsewhere in the story. It seems like Willow was ready to take her relationship with Oz to the next level, but Oz was distant and wasn't ready, or there's
yeah,
something going on with him.
Willow and Oz had their own backstory too. I wish they could have done more to make that a better standalone episode, but it's you do have to really see what leads up to it to appreciate it fully. But it's still a great episode, because I think there's also this theme, that people that if you kill somebody, they never really leave you, which I find interesting. It's that was in Christmas of 1998 that aired. It was the whole power to do good, and and of course the whole thing about the first evil, which is just another play on the devil or Satan, I think. But yeah, there's always Buffy has I don't really watch much TV anymore, but if anybody can point me to a Christmas episode of any TV show that's better than that one, I'll watch it. But I haven't seen it yet. It's I will.
Even
But
even though
Buffy did a Halloween episode every year, and they were all very good too.
yeah, so the Buffy episode also reminded me of movies like It's a Wonderful Life and It's a Christmas Carol, or A Christmas Carol, because it involves memories and recall and looking into your past, but the plot device is different. So in the older stories, you'd have an angel who has to come and almost force the person to look upon their past and their actions. But in Buffy, it's Angel is recalling his past himself. It's like it's a self-driven form of redemption, right? He has these nightmares, and he's so in his own dreams, he's dreaming about his past. So that's the plot device to get him to go on this redemption arc.
Yeah. And then later, her dreams, his dreams start to invade her dreams. That was a theme they used early in the series, but later in the series they kind of abandoned that theme of Buffy having dreams and seeing visions and stuff that kind of solve the problems. I don't know why they abandoned that theme, but it was something they used a lot in the early part of the seasons. I think
How far did they take that? Because in the episode I watched, they both knew they were in the dreams together, but I don't think they did much in the dreams.
Well, they spun him off into his own series after this season. That was another problem. So I don't know. I don't know if the series was ever quite the same without him. Although I got into it later, so then I ended up watching it from the beginning to the current. So anything else that really stands out for you? I mean, we didn't really talk much about Charlie Brown or Rudolph or anything like that.
Well, those are also good stories, but no, I don't have any major insights to those.
I think Rudolph is just this great story about the outcast becoming the hero, and I think a lot of kids identified with that. It was apparently a story that a guy actually wrote for his little girl to cheer her up, and it was in Montgomery Ward started distributing it, and then they gave him the rights back, and that was and then that became famous. Yeah, there was another. And I also watched it recently too. There was actually a Bloom County Christmas special, and it was with Opus writing a letter to Santa asking for wings at work because Opus is a penguin, so he can't fly.
Uh-huh.
So he wants to be able to fly like the other birds, and then Santa has an accident, ends up in this lake, and Opus goes and rescues him from the lake, and of course, because Opus can do that, because penguins have this ability to swim, and then Opus realizes that he has another power that other birds don't have because of his ability to rescue Santa. So it was, that was cute. Although, interestingly enough, Berkeley Breathe did not like that. After it was, he later said, "My style of humor just wasn't suited for TV," but it was a good effort, though. And he didn't really he only included Opus. You won't see a lot of the other Bloom County characters in it, but I absolutely love Bloom County. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to say at this point, Will. Seems like we've had a pretty good talk about Christmas objectivism and everything else. So
yeah, I'm happy to have discussed all these Christmas movies because it's a fascinating topic, and since objectivism is an atheistic religion, it's important. Or
an atheistic religion.
Atheistic philosophy. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's important to try to connect with the religious traditions, and see what is valuable there, and maybe form some rituals of our own and based on those old traditions. And I think that's where the objectivist movement needs to go, is to start building its base of ritual type holidays and get-togethers and parties and actions.
Yeah, we need something. I'd also be maybe look up that French movie that was about the Christmas truce. They made a movie about that. Although it's French, it'd be.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar with.
There's a lot of stuff out there you can look up, but yeah. So okay, William, thank you very much for coming onto the Fountainhead Forum. Do you have any? You can find William's show, the Ayn Rand Fan Club. Is that only on YouTube, Will, or?
Yeah, it's on YouTube at Ayn Rand Fan Club. That's the channel.
Yeah.
And you can also find me on Facebook, William Swig.
Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And of course, you can find me at chrisbaker.net, or you can find my novel Escape from the Village. And and we'll be uploading this episode soon. And things have gone well so far, and I certainly look forward to chatting with you more. And maybe we'll meet at a seminar or something sometime in the future, Will. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.